Welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Calibra. I'm Stephen Fagg, Director at Database Trends and Applications in Unisphere Research. I will be your host for today's broadcast. Our presentation today is titled, Creating a Data Culture Based on Data Transparency. Before we begin, I want to explain how you can be a part of this broadcast. There will be a question and answer session. If you have a question during the presentation, just type it into the question box provided and click on the Submit button. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but if your question has not been selected during the show, you will receive an email response. Plus, all viewers today will be entered to win a $100 American Express gift card. Now, to introduce our speakers for today, Sherri Adame, Chief Customer Data Governance Officer at Cigna, and Chris Cooper, Healthcare Principal at Calibra. For more information on our speakers today, you can click on the arrows under their headshots. Now I'm going to pass the event over to Sherri.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Sherri from Cigna. I am the Chief Data Governance Officer for both Customer and Reference Master Data Management. I've been with Cigna now about 3.5 years. When I first started, I was focused just on creating a strategy or implementing a strategy around metadata management. After being at Cigna about 6 months, then I was also assigned the responsibility for customer master data management as well as our reference master data management teams and initiatives. So since then, I've really been focused on how do I create the right culture around our customer master data, and how do I bring data transparency to where previously there really was none. So the issue that I faced right away when I took the team over was constantly being barraged with all kinds of information from my stakeholders saying the data is not right. More times than not, it wasn't that our data wasn't right. It was that the person who was saying the data was not right, didn't have the right context for the data, didn't quite understand what process that data was used in, or what the metric they were looking at actually summarized. So I knew somehow I needed to connect with people so that they understood what customer master data management is, what it does, and then if they're using customer data, they understand what that customer data is. When we started down the journey of bringing transparency to the data so that people understand its context and how it's used, in the first year, we really organized with two main teams. We had a data management team that focused on, okay, what's the roadmap for customer MDM? Where is the customer MDM heading? And what is the new project work that we have to implement in order to enhance or fine-tune the things that we had in place? The second team was the keep your lights on team, right? The daily operations folks. Those are the people with feet on the floor that are looking at that customer data on a daily basis. If there's a ticket where a customer has called and said, hey, something's not quite right, these are the folks that would actually look at the customer data, inspect it, and then help to resolve those tickets, or at least point folks in the right position. So we did that for about a year. It was at the beginning of this year that we really said, you know what, it's not just about where we're heading and keeping the lights on every day. It is really about also putting in place end-to-end data governance on our customer master data. And that's a tough word sometimes. A lot of times when I say data governance in particular forums, I'll have that deep sigh. I'll say, oh, and let's talk about how we're going to govern this data, and people will have that deep sigh or that deep breath like, oh, no, here she comes again talking about that data governance piece. So to form a team, a cross-functional team around implementing end-to-end data governance, I knew it was the right thing, and our team knew it was the right thing. All my peers agreed we really should head down this path, but it wasn't a really easy thing to get it up and going. We had to make sure that we understood what are the things that we want to put in place for data governance, what are the levers within a data culture we really want to press on? What is the success criteria for this team? And for us, it was really, when we thought about the data culture, we want this cross-functional team to really have an impact on what's happening within the data culture and all of the processes and practices around our customer MDM. So we really had to connect to the culture. So we spent a lot of time understanding what are the different levers that push on data culture, and then where do we want our cross-functional data governance team to focus and to manage and to create change for folks. So what we ended up thinking about was, well, let's focus on the things that are within our control. So let's focus on the aspect of collaboration and really focus on that with a lot of energy and making sure that everything that we do to put in end-to-end data governance actually is in conjunction with the stakeholders, both the producers of customer data and the consumers of customer data. So for us this year, it's been about breaking down data silos. So everything that we do for that team is some type of practical application that engages with the people actually within their daily practices so that we can cultivate champions of change. Everybody wants to be an advocate for something good. So if I can bring data transparency to our data stewards team who can also share that out with the business, then I can have advocates not only within my team but outside of my team, really cultivating change for the organization when it comes to how we do data management, what is the discipline that we put in place. I talked about how we really want to create an environment that embraces that transparency and allows people to not only discuss metrics on a daily basis, but to share metrics across teams, across functions, and across the organization. So since November timeframe last year, we've really focused on using the right language because I can't create champions of change. I can't create an environment that embraces transparency unless everybody uses the right language. And not the same language, which is completely different, but uses the right language. So that's been our focus this year, is really how do we push people to use the right language so that we understand each other. And then the last thing that we've also focused on is how do we create open source or easy buttons for folks. So if they need to do some type of data management or data governance, they have like an easy button that they can press on to actually execute it. So when we started thinking about using the right language, I started to look across our organization with the team, and we really identified that everybody uses a different language within the organization. Our data governance folks, if you talk to them about customer data, they really talk about our core customer data policy that has some high-level, broad statements on how we should manage customer data. The business data stewards, when they talk about customer data, they talk about it in terms of, oh, that's our critical data and it must be populated all the time. Our enterprise data stewards talk about things in terms of data standards. So if I were to bring up first name, they would say, oh, I've got a standard for that. It should be this long. Here's all the different fields that we use to collect first name, and here's any reference data sets associated with it. Our data quality analysts think about, when they think about the field first name, they think, okay, that field shouldn't be null. The data modeler engages with the field with its physical name that is going within the table, database, or schema to that's going to house that field. Business operations, when they talk about the customer's first name, they think, oh, that's the member's first name. We need to have the member's first name. Marketing thinks about it as customers, digital as individuals, and then your database administrator and developers think about things in terms of the database and schema. So for us, the trick is, how do we get everybody to use the right language so that we understand what's happening within the organization, so that we can build in optimization to our new data deliveries, and so that we can manage and maintain customer data appropriately across all these different types of stakeholders. It started with first engaging to understand who plays each one of these roles. So who is in charge of data governance for a particular area? So we identified 3 or 4 folks that have been playing data governance roles for our customer master data, and then we did the same across the board. Who are the right individuals to engage with on a regular basis so we can understand the language that they use, and then how do we document what that language is? We really did that through metadata. So we started on the journey for metadata, like I said, now 3 years ago. We realized that there's a disparate set of artifacts across the organization that actually describe every data asset across those different perspectives that the teams have. Some of those artifacts were in spreadsheets. Some of those artifacts are reading the system catalog for a physical database. Some of those artifacts came from modeling teams or analytic modeling teams. And all of those artifacts were across the 4 different types of metadata. So the first type of metadata is business metadata. That's the metadata that you can collect that really describes the business context for the data. So it's the business definition and description. Technical metadata is the technical metadata that really describes the physical characteristics of the data and the physical aspects of the data asset in which it resides. Operational metadata enriches both business and technical metadata with a better understanding of the current state of the data. That's where you get into your data quality measurements, how the data is loading and the scheduling around that data as well. And then social metadata. We haven't made a lot of progress when it comes to social metadata, but we know that this is really important, because if I sit with any of the analytic modelers within Cigna, I will see them say, oh, when I'm trying to figure this out, I'll look at the spreadsheet that my predecessor gave me. I have this other SharePoint site that Sally showed me, and then I can use this query tool that allows me to actually query the data. So there's something to be said for those pockets of information and then getting that annotation actually attached and related to all the rest of the metadata. We're really hoping in the back half of this year we can start to capitalize on that, but we haven't yet. So we collect artifacts from our data governance team, our data stewardship team, our data modeling team, data quality. We go outside of our teams and collect information about analytic models. We have some retention information from our legal team, and then we have some security or information protection related metadata that we also collect and integrate and put through trusted data metadata standards. So if a customer or if a stakeholder of ours actually understands the data, then they trust it. So that is really what we're pushing for, is to take all of these artifacts in and then put them within an asset model that allows us to see the relationships across all the different metadata, but now also allows our stakeholders to trust the data that they're working with. Because if they can understand it, then they can trust it. So that's one of the areas that we've been focused on. So these are all the artifacts that we've deployed that we harvest and then use to understand and create data transparency and allow people to speak the same language, so that if you are a database administrator, if you were to search on the phrase or abbreviation that you're familiar with, we'll bring up all the rest of the metadata that we have around that data asset, and you can really understand its context and how it's being used within the organization. So it's not easy to collect these, but we do collect the artifacts out into our data lake area, and then we have an import process that allows us to put it within Calibra. So what Calibra has is super cool. We use their out-of-box asset model. Within the asset model, there are what we would say 4 types of assets: business assets, data assets, governance assets, and technology assets. We took our artifacts, our metadata artifacts that we're collecting and managing within Cigna and mapped it to those Calibra asset types. And then we were able to import everything in and create the relationships across things. So it's the first time we have a business glossary that allows us to actually relate terms back to our physical assets and see those assets. And then we also manage our reference data within the same tool. So what does it all look like in the end? So this is it. This is what it looks like when it's all transparent to the business. I'm going to spend some time talking about this slide. So once you've identified the 4 types of metadata that you have and you've populated it within the out-of-box asset model that Calibra has, you have the ability to now truly speak the language across all of those teams and all of those stakeholders. We have the ability to say for the business term first name, it's related to our data category or data domain customer, however it's defined at your organization. And then the business term also has a data standard that's related to it, an enterprise data standard. And within that data standard, it has reference to or it links back to our core customer data policy. So we've been able to navigate from policy language, which just defines the broad requirements for how you need to manage your customer data and the discipline that you have to put around it. We relate that policy to a data standard. The data standard contains the business rules, and each business rule has been broken down into a data rule that we can actually execute measurements against. And then it relates back to the terms. So we have the ability now to see not only what the data is, what are the policies and standards that apply to that data, what are the business rules, so the plain English language description of how that data should be managed and what the discipline is to put around it, but also the data rule that says things like if the business says that field must be populated, then that means when I'm measuring in my DQ processes, I need to have a rule that says check to make sure that that field is not null or blank. So it's the first time that we've been able to do this, and we're embedding this now within our data delivery processes, coming up with a process where we deliver a data standard first, and then we use that within the design. And this type of view allows our folks to talk across teams and to accelerate delivery of different data items. On the left side of the screen is where you see everything in yellow are the physical attributes. So I can go from a policy level to understand what are all the terms related that apply within that policy, what are all the data elements or data items that relate to those terms, and then in what physical schema, database, and environment does the data actually reside. So within Calibra, they call this a traceability model. I think definitely traceability, definitely lineage. I think this particular model also does a great job of really allowing you to pull forward that data transparency so that folks can really truly understand the context of the data and how it's managed within the organization. And that's really all I have. Now I'm going to pass it over to Chris Cooper.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherri. I really appreciate it. And I think, what you shared is a great example of how an organization can really begin to connect the dots between, policy, between the way that your data is actually used in the organization and the way that people think about it and how they speak to it. And I appreciate, the specific context of that. What I wanted to do for the remainder of our time before we open it up for some questions is to talk a little bit about how our other healthcare customers, as well as Cigna, are really starting to address some of these macro challenges that exist within the healthcare ecosystem as it relates to the data that they have. And certainly, much of this is related to an explosion of data volume. Whether it's the addition of social demographic data that we're bringing into the environment, whether it's a breadth of information that is now being exchanged between the delivery organizations and the health plans, being able to connect the dots has been hugely valuable from a data perspective and the expansion of data sharing that we have between the ecosystem. But it's created new challenges around finding data, and so what we're seeing is that consistently, organizations are spending far too much time looking for that data, and many times it's because they don't have that context of what is related to the concept that I'm working with. We also see that there's a proliferation of sources, and that proliferation of sources is additionally challenging because it can really result in incomplete or wrong data being used in a given environment or situation. If I don't understand that there are potentially customer records that are distributed across the organization, or patient records or member records, being able to make sure that I have that full scope of information is absolutely critical as I start to drive that decision process. We also see that there's a challenge around democratization of data, and that's really, I think, important in what Sherri touched on, and the fact that we're expecting everyone in the organization to use data on a consistent basis, but we don't even have a common framework or a common language that we use to speak about the same data. And so it's very, very difficult as to operate in that democratic fashion to be able to have anyone in the organization understand and work with that data if we're using completely different language to refer to the same concept. So having that ability to relate and tie back all of the different ways that we use the same concepts and using different language is incredibly important to make sure that we really make sure that we don't limit the value of the data that we have in the organization. Obviously, for those of you familiar with healthcare, we've got an extremely complex set of data that we work with. The structure of data to describe the biological process, the complexity of the financial responsibility and fiduciary responsibility behind care is significant. So making sure that we have that complete set of information is really important to make sure that we're able to connect the dots for organizations and make sure that we have a common understanding, a common library of that data that's available. We also see that there's really an increase in, how data is being regulated. Healthcare has certainly faced significant regulatory challenges, and how we use, share, and our requirements for protecting data are certainly not new. But I think what we're seeing is that certainly the existing standards that are in place really are only the tip of the spear, as we see privacy and data protection really becoming the norm across organizations. And so understanding how data can and should be used is an important aspect of really making sure that we adhere to that additional data regulation. And so as we look at this, broad set of challenges, there's a couple of themes that tend to emerge. And one of the big themes that we see is that, information simply isn't accessible. People can't find what they're looking for. And this is a key notion that Calibra really looks to deliver to organizations, and helping people find, not just by providing that great search capability to search across the various silos of data that exist, but also to relate, as Sherri indicated, how that policy is tied back to the multiple ways that we describe customer or member, as well as all of the different ways that physical data is actually represented in the organization. So it's being able to bring together both your internal and external data sets. It's about being able to clearly define metrics and KPIs across your glossary so that you're able to associate the different ways that people refer to our members and all of the different terminology that's used in the organization. And as Sherri indicated, that notion of collaboration, there's a lot of expertise that exists within our organizations. We need to be able to reuse that and leverage that social capability so that we can collaborate. We can understand what are the experts across our organization using, who are those experts in the organization, and how do we start to rate and review, how do we bring forward some of these social constructs that have been successful in the consumerization of many aspects of our lives into the operational data process that we have, so that people can really find what's valuable information across the organization. So it's bringing together a set of capabilities across a breadth of both business and technical metadata that's absolutely critical to help organizations find the right information. And that needs to be exposed within the context that any organization can rapidly use and adopt that information. Sherri said one of my favorite words throughout her discussion, and that's context. One of the things that we're often missing, and really is the root of that, the data is not right complaint that we hear far too often, is that people simply don't have the context. We have lots of different ways that we define the same concept in an organization. Something as simple as length of stay may have 5 or 6 different definitions depending upon the context of the business operation that I'm dealing with, the part of the organization that I'm engaged with. So having that clear definition and relationship between the different metrics and business concepts that we work with is absolutely critical to driving understanding. And we need to understand that, we may simply be in an organization where it's necessary that we have multiple definitions for the same concept, but I need to understand within a given context of the data that I'm working with, the business question that I'm trying to solve, what's the appropriate definition, and does that relate back to the data that I'm using? Is that a definition or that metric that I'm working with actually calculated appropriately? So Calibra provides not only that ability to manage those multiple definitions, but also the ability to relate them between themselves, between the data that they interact with, and the different parts of the organization that may be using those different definitions and how they relate. Sherri showed a great example of lineage or traceability, and how lineage and traceability is not just the classic, what is the data flow, but how are the different parts of the organization interacting and engaging? What is the relationship between our various policies, quality rules, business definitions, business rules, and then the underlying data structures themselves? So being able to bring together that lineage at the appropriate view for the organization is incredibly critical. Some folks simply need to understand that data came from internal systems and a mix of external systems. Other folks in the organization really need to understand every transformation that occurred within that information, within that data. And so making that an interactive process to visually explore the relationships between business, technical, metadata, operational and social metadata is incredibly important. And I think that one of the things that's often missed as we're looking at the context of understanding is what is the role of data quality within that process. Certainly Calibra is a solution that allows you to bring in what you know about your data quality into that context, because in many cases quality is not an absolute. If I'm doing some forecasting and predictive analysis, my acceptance of data quality is probably a lot more liberal than if I'm actually driving a patient care decision. So having that information and providing that additional context is critical, so that I, as an information consumer or user, really have the context that can start to apply how that data relates to my understanding. And so many times answering that question of, is the data right, is critical from a data quality perspective. Know, is it right in the context of how I'm attempting to use that information? So Calibra brings together that breadth of both business and technical metadata, as well as the operational and social aspects of metadata, to really give a comprehensive view that can be explored visually for the organization. And then finally, there's a concept around trust, and how do we make sure that we can trust that this is the right information. It's not just providing that lineage and that data quality, but it's also about working through a process so that you can start to certify what are the right information and data assets. Has that metric definition actually been reviewed by the various stakeholders? Who are those stakeholders that needed to sign off, and has that process occurred? And Calibra provides that workflow capability to support that, automate where possible, and then obviously make sure that the processes that are defined from a data operations perspective are adhered to and followed throughout the organization. And that really starts to provide trust. So not only the fact that that process has been defined, but it's been adhered to for each of the business and technical assets and information sources that I'm working with. And then being able to tie that back to my policy really supports that notion of a structured data process. These are the things that, while often related to a little bit of that eye rolling that's associated with data governance, we can really start to operationalize that process and put in place a system that means I don't have to go through a spreadsheet of information every month and check things off. I can have a process that looks for changes. I can put the relevant changes in front of the right people and engage them in a very natural, automated nature. It really helps make sure that that process is sustainable. Simply defining a process on paper is a long way from getting something that the organization can follow and flow on a regular basis. What we see at Calibra is that certainly Calibra provides that system of record for the organization, connecting the dots between technical and business metadata coming across our technology landscape. Certainly we see that the CIO has a number of systems, ServiceNow being one of the common examples where organizations are starting to centralize that system of record for change control from an IT perspective. Certainly on the care delivery side, we see the electronic health record becoming that system of record for patient engagement as care is being delivered. And certainly Calibra sees ourselves really at the center of that system of record for the CDO, so aggregating that technical metadata from lots of different sources, as well as acting as a place for the organization to really start to document key policies and business metrics to make sure that there is a cohesive, connected view as you start to deploy policies, data sources across a very complex landscape that most organizations have to deal with, and certainly that we see at Cigna. Calibra really serves as that system of record for the data team. So we have a platform that is really designed to be deployed across an enterprise and really is ready at enterprise scale. So being able to connect the capabilities across lineage, workflow capabilities, all of the features and functions that we think of around delivering a system of record for data is part of the core Calibra platform. We enable a lot of those governance aspects, being able to tie in policies, being able to relate your business definitions, and make sure that there is a stewardship process that's enabled for managing, importing, approving metadata across the environment. The Cleaver catalog really provides that source to be able to expose sets of data, information assets, reporting assets back to the organization, and really enables the organization to have a comprehensive view of what information assets are available to the organization. And certainly what we see organizations looking for is additional capabilities to start to recommend the best data sets, the most highly valued information sets. And so starting to apply AI technologies to not only curate those catalogs of information, but also being able to expose that back to the organization. And certainly what we see organizations starting to do is not only cataloging their data assets and their reporting assets, but those algorithms that are being used to automate a lot of the data process. We touched briefly on this notion of privacy and risk management. Certainly, Europe has set the standard for that as it relates to GDPR, but certainly in California and New York and across North America, we're starting to see additional privacy regulations that are building upon what we've been working with in healthcare, and are really starting to expose an additional layer of process around making sure that we have the appropriate agreement from our customers on how we're using their data. We have that transparency to understand the interactions and the relationships between how that data comes into our organization, how it's used, and what is the appropriate policy and context that applies, so that we can adhere to the obligations that the regulations are placing on us, and that we need to take as responsible organizations across the platform. So as we look at this type of complex data platform, Cleaver really does look to provide that framework to connect that broad set of information sources for organizations, so they can really understand what's there. At Cleaver, we're very fortunate to work with a broad set of healthcare organizations, health plans like Cigna, regional plans as well. We're engaged with a number of delivery organizations, both those thought leaders across major markets, as well as a number of smaller organizations. And what we see across healthcare is a consistent need to drive and use data more effectively, to democratize that data. And certainly what we see is that Cleaver's focus is to enable those data citizens, anyone in your organization, to be able to effectively use data across the organization and have that context that's really needed to be able to connect the dots. And certainly providing that platform from a support perspective, an offering is key, but Cleaver understands significantly that it's a lot more than a technology problem. The things that we're dealing with are about process and organizational change. So having a community of experts where you can understand that set of best practices is critical to this process. You need to not only train your teams as you start to take these new initiatives, as you start to connect the dots between what has been a traditional data management activity and an operational activity, and you need to enable the organization. And so having that education process that you can deploy to your organization, whether it's simply answering the question of why do you care, to being able to dig into the implementation of specific technologies and configuring a workflow for that approval. Cleaver University connects and provides that additional value offering. We see that there's a strong demand for integration of capabilities and sharing of best practices, and Cleaver provides that marketplace for not only the exchange of connectivity options to integrate with various tools and technologies, but also to be able to exchange ideas, to put in place best practice workflows and share that commonality across organizations. And then certainly we see that much of this is driven by the people in the organization. And so we just completed the Data Citizens Conference recently in May. There'll be another one coming up this fall in London. We certainly encourage not only the sharing of information and best practices, but really a learning across the ecosystem. And we see that that's the way that organizations are really going to start to shift the curve and make sure that data intelligence becomes a key initiative, and we drive this collaboration not only within our organizations, but across organizations. And certainly this type of information sharing is one of the things that we see as critical to that process. So Calibra's data governance and catalog solutions really give your team a powerful set of tools that allow your users to consume data across the enterprise, really democratizing that, enabling everybody in your organization to become a data citizen. That flexibility and configuration of the solution allows organizations as large as Cigna and as small as a regional hospital to start to engage with and maximize the value of the data that they are working with. And we certainly welcome, the opportunity to engage with your organization, share the best practices we've seen. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll pass it back over to Stephen to run us through a few questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. We are going to go into questions from our viewers, and the first question, as data is collected, defined, and categorized, were there any ethical considerations? And I think that question was pointed towards Sherri.
So that's a really interesting question. When I think about ethics with managing the metadata or the information about the data assets that we're collecting and relating within the Calibra platform, we do think about who the consumers of that data are and what the expected consumption would be and for what purpose. So beyond considering that for the metadata around the data assets, we just want to make sure we understand who's using the information and the context about our data assets that we're providing and how are they using it.
Understood. Our next question, to what degree did cultural nuances impact decisions, especially when considering global operations, either internally or externally?
I'm assuming that's for me again?
I think that is.
Okay. So loads of cultural considerations, actually. What we've found is, so within our customer MDM, we take in 32 different sources and integrate them within the MDM, and then we deliver down to 52 consuming processes. I would say every single source and every single consumer has a different personality and a different culture just within their team. So we prioritize the list of sources that have the most impact on the customer MDM. And when we started to think about how do we collect the metadata for those assets, and then how do we represent all of the different relationships across the asset model, from the top 5 teams, every single team that we engaged with on the top 5 from the top 5 sources, one, it was a sleuthing activity to figure out who the contacts were, and then who actually ultimately has the power to understand and inventory, classify that data asset. But each team really has a culture within which it works. Some of the teams are agile, some of the teams are not agile. Some of the teams are full of people who have been hired into the organization in the last 1 to 2 years, and they're ready and ripe for changes. And then some of the teams have been around for 20, 25 years, and the thought of making a change in any way, was really overwhelming. We heard a lot of times, well, this is how we've always done it, so this is what we like to always do. And we're really asking the organization now to think about things in a different way. So I would say it comes into play with every team we engage with. We have to understand what the culture is within that team, what the culture is within the organization that team resides within, and then what are the specific things we want to focus on and really push forward.
Understood. And how many people are on your customer data team?
So you would think we had an army, right? Because Cigna has, over 80 million active customers, but we really don't. We have about 15 people that are dedicated to the customer MDM across those 3 areas: data management, daily operations, and data governance.
Got it. And where does your team report into? The CFO, the CIO?
That's also a good question. I get asked that question a lot whenever I give a presentation. So I've personally reported in both on the business side as well as on the technical side. When I started at Cigna, we were on the business side, and then as with all the changes that always happen, we've now been since moved to the IT side. I think it can work on either side. It just depends on what the ultimate goals of the organization are.
Understood. Thanks for clarifying. Our next question, Sherri, how do you identify the right data steward champion?
Oh my gosh. So this is one where I would say I'm pretty hardcore on it. I don't think that an organization can hire in a new data steward champion. So I think the data steward champion is somebody who intimately understands the data, has kind of grown up in the organization, and understands not only the physicality of the data, but how that data is used within operation. And then I'm assuming at other organizations it's the same, but every data asset has a certain number of stakeholders or influencers around that data asset that allow you or not allow you to do things. You need to really understand who those folks are as well. So champion type data steward would have to be somebody who's been there, understands the environment, and actually understands the data. And for me, data people are black and white. You're either a data person or you're not. There is no middle ground on that.
Gotcha. So our next question, how were you able to implement the data delivery standard process?
Data delivery standard process. Oh, so I call that a data standard first approach, really. So with our delivery team last year, so all of Cigna has been asked to go agile. So the way that we plan is we have planning iterations, and we plan all our work by sprints. And during our planning time, we always plan for the next program increment, as well as a thought of what would happen after that. So typically what we've done is we'll write our epics and features, and we'll ask the delivery team to deliver on a business description of work to be done. This year we had some data work to be done, and we engaged with our enterprise data steward to come in and first write the data standard, so that people can understand not only what the business is describing, but how what the business is describing would be reflected within data. We did that around the concept of a customer household. Then we handed that data standard to our solution architect, who got a very solid understanding of not only the business context for the request, and the business necessity for the request, but also a view of what the data should look like. So the solution ultimately, I think, will be a better solution than we've ever had in the past, because it's the first time we took the concept of data governance and embedded it really within the delivery process.
Understood. And we just have one more question for you. It's fantastic that you were able to join us today. It's definitely a hot topic. Sherri, based on your experience, what do you feel is the greatest benefit of using Calibra?
Greatest benefit? Well, I don't know. I've been doing data management for a long time, and we've been able to pull together those 4 types of metadata and put them into a single view. I've not seen that done before. That is something that we tried to do from the moment I started with Cigna, and we tried a different approach originally, and it did not work out for us. So Calibra really allows us to bring in all of that metadata, relate it to other metadata, give a single view that is searchable across all those different languages that people have within the organization. So, I think that's data nirvana. And if we can figure out as an organization how to exploit the value of all of those things being represented in a way that anyone can understand, I see a lot of competitive advantage for us.
Thank you very much. Once again, I'd like to thank our speakers today, Sherri Adame, Chief Customer Data Governance Officer at Cigna, and Chris Cooper, Healthcare Professional at Calibra. If you would like to review this presentation or send it to a colleague, please use the same URL that you used for today's live event. It will be archived, and you'll receive an email tomorrow once the archive is posted. And just for participating in today's event, you could win this $100 American Express gift card. The winner will be announced on July 31st. We will reach out to you via email if you are the lucky viewer. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's presentation. Speakers, please stand by for your post-conference.